Okay. So, my name is Angela Emerson, and I'm the Stewardship Canon for Stewardship in the Episcopal Diocese of Vermont. And this is sort of the basic orientation to stewardship. So the presentation will be broken down really sort of in two halves. One is about really exploring in a great depth what it is that we're trying to accomplish when we do a stewardship campaign, whether we call it a commitment campaign or a pledge campaign or stewardship campaign, whatever we call it. We need to be clear on what it is that we are trying to do, and it's not just about funding the budget. Before we get into that, I want to address a couple of mistakes that a lot of people make, or barriers to a successful campaign. And welcome. Well, you haven't missed anything. We're just starting. First of all, it really is not necessary to have pledge cards to do a stewardship campaign. Now in Vermont, we have very, very, very small churches, and their average Sunday attendance is held steady at usually less than 20. And regardless of their changes in who's actually attending, the income is pretty steady. And they sort of know how much money they're going to have, and they don't do stewardship letters and they don't do pledge cards. So get rid of the assumption that you have to do a pledge card. It's not necessary. Everybody can determine your income trend over the past 3 to 5 years, and chances are you're going to follow that trend, whether it's up or down. So you really don't need the pledge cards to do a budget. Secondly, there is a tendency to talk about stewardship as if its goal is to be able to know how many pledges you have so you can develop the budget. That's just not accurate. Your more reliable information is from that average, because whatever that trend is, it's probably going to continue. And creating the budget has really nothing to do with stewardship. That's more of an accounting tool and a planning tool that needs to be completely divorced from stewardship. The last thing I want to say is that, and this is the guts of what we'll do today, is that the church really only has one business and one purpose, and that is the formation of disciples. Now, whether you talk about it as formation of disciples, or I like to talk about it as growing our identity as stewards, or there's being the hands and feet of Christ in the world, however you express that single purpose of the church, we always have to stay focused on that. And everything else we do, whether it's stewardship or choosing paint colors for the bathrooms or repairing the roof, we try and approach that task in a way that helps us grow in that identity. And that certainly is true for stewardship and for fundraising, for all of the activities of the church. So what I hope that we can accomplish in the first part is to really get solidly focused on what it is that we're trying to do to commit ourselves to that one purpose of the church. So any questions at this point? No, nobody wants to argue with me about how you plan a budget without pledge cards? Good for you, you're a very mature audience. I don't get that very often.
We're just worried about how we're going to convince everybody else. That's
right, well, we're going to talk about that. So the first thing we're going to do is focus on the word steward, because steward is a biblical word. So if we get rid of that stewardship word and just focus on the word steward for a while. And frankly, I commend to you the practice of stop talking about stewardship and start talking about our lives as stewards. Because steward is a biblical word. And there are certain things that are inherent in the understanding of what it means to be a steward. First of all, a steward manages resources. So you're a manager of both tangible and intangible kinds of things. And those resources have an owner. So the first major point is to be a steward is to not be an owner. You can't be both. Now that's a fundamentally, it's fundamentally in contrast to notions in our culture of private ownership of property. So for us, we are stewards of all that belongs to God. And God has entrusted all that God has created to us. That's the fundamental principle behind what we're trying to teach and accomplish as we go through stewardship campaigns. A steward stands in the place of the owner with the same hopes, the same desires, the same aspirations, tries as much as possible to do with the resources entrusted to the steward that the owner would do. So we express that as growing in the image of Christ, as growing in our knowledge and love of God. We express it in many different ways, but the idea is that as a steward, we want to do with all that God has created what God hoped for and wants and yearns for, and it's the whole purpose for which we are created, to grow into that. So with 100% of everything God has entrusted to us, we try and do God's work in the world. 100%, everything. Psalm 24 says, "The world belongs to the Lord and all who dwell therein." That's a tough sell in our culture, but that's the heart of what we're trying to do. And to understand that we act as much as we possibly can with the mind of God. We are accountable to God, but God is not a micromanager. The full authority to deal with the resources of God are given to us. Questions? Comments?
Sometimes I wish God were a micromanager.
But it's the beauty, you know. We can all grow at our own pace and our own way. And this is not only where the rubber meets the road, because when you start talking about, in our culture, you really are not the owner of anything that you have. You're really going against the grain. And particularly when you talk to people that their money is not their own. You can sometimes see the bristling of, but I worked for this money. God didn't work for this money. And again, our whole system of jurisprudence is based on the protection of private ownership of property. You're really talking about a significant way of thinking about ourselves and about our resources. And when you challenge people to think, how would you live your life differently if you really thought of all that you have as belonging to someone else and not to you? They'll nod yes to the theological concept, but it's really hard to get them to think about, what would I do with my money? What would I do with how I spend my money? What would I do even with my home and my cars and what belongs to me if I really thought it belonged to somebody else? But this is the essence of what we're trying to get people to understand. So it's a question of Christian identity, being a steward, of understanding that God created us to be stewards in the very beginning. You know, we were created to be stewards. Adam and Eve were placed in the garden to tend to it, to till it, and our task is to exercise God's dominion over all that God has created. I encourage you, the more you think about this and talk to people about this, to be prepared for really some anger and some frustration and some pushback of people not wanting to talk about this, because its implications for us mean a complete change in lifestyle. So get prepared for that if you try and teach it. And I encourage you to teach it, but teach it gently and with understanding that many people are going to have difficulty with this.
Yeah, doesn't the word subdue mostly imply a very different relationship of domination?
Many translations use different words, subdue, dominion, and I like to talk about it as dominion, but it's God's dominion. You know, when God says exercise dominion, you're talking about God's dominion, which is free of exploitation, free of hierarchy, free of exploitation. It's a different kind of understanding of exercising dominion over the earth. It's a way of accepting God's will. And we want to act the same way that God would act if God were making all the decisions about our money. Is that helpful? Oh. So not only are we stewards of all of creation and all of the tangible things in the world, but Paul says, let me get my quotes here, in 1 Peter, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. That's 1 Peter 4:10. And in 1 Corinthians 4:1, think of us in this way as servants of Christ and stewards of God's mysteries. So not only are we stewards of all that is physical and all that is created in the world, but the very grace of God is part of what we are responsible for sharing with others. There is within the concept of being a steward this sense of things flow through, that the owner entrusts to us certain resources. We take what we need for our own sustenance and well-being, and the rest of it gets passed on. So we think of the church and of stewardship, of receiving the gifts and the offerings of the people of God, but then we distribute them in other ways to others so that other people benefit, taking only what we need. We are, as stewards, we are not consumers. We are not concerned with consuming everything that comes to us, nor are we focused on building things up, keeping more than we need, but making sure that those resources are available to all of God's people. That's part of what we do. Questions? One of the basic questions that we can ask as we do stewardship is the question of how have you experienced God's grace in your life today? How, as a member of this community of faith, do you experience God's grace? And I think you will find that many people will just look back at you blankly. Because we're really not, it's not that we don't experience it, but we've stopped looking for it in so many ways. Except for maybe in the expectation of some pretty music or a good sermon on Sunday mornings, as if somehow that's the only way that God's grace comes to us. A good starting point for stewardship campaigns is to raise this question: how have you experienced God's grace, and how are you a good steward of it? And to get people to begin to tell those stories of how they have experienced God and the multitude of God's grace. I said this one time in a webinar, and a gentleman said, you know, I come from a very small congregation and we already know each other's stories. And I thought to myself, you've stopped looking for God in your life. Because there's never an end to the stories that we can tell about God's grace. Never. And if we get stuck in that place of I don't know a story to tell, that's a good sign that you've stopped looking for God's grace. One way to begin to promote this kind of thinking in the church is anytime you have small group gatherings, and I'm really big on doing this in vestries, is to start out by saying, what are you grateful for today? And take off the list family, health, home, job. Find something else to be grateful for other than those things, and make people go a little bit deeper. And hope that somebody says, you know, I'm really grateful that I have shoes on my feet. Because not everybody in the world does that. Grace and gratitude and generosity go hand in hand. So any kind of question you can ask to help people get in touch with those experiences in their life. And I'll tell you, don't forget the kids. Because kids get this. They get these things. And they will tell you stories that will make the adults cry. All right, this is the one that's really hard to see. Could somebody just flip the lights off for just a minute? This will be easier to see. So steward is one of those basic woo, that's really dark. Yeah. Can read it better though, right? Yeah. So steward is one biblical word, grace is another biblical word, and generosity is another. And generosity is a spiritual gift. And this is Paul's way of saying it, and you all have heard this forever. Live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want. You know, so think about that. There is in our created being a desire to be generous people, but a lot of things get in the way of that. But in contrast to the flesh, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So generosity is a gift of the Spirit. And part of what we want to do in our stewardship campaigns is to nurture that spirit of generosity. Because it is a spiritual gift. It is also a spiritual practice. And by practicing generosity, you nurture the spirit of generosity. Now, what do I mean by a spiritual practice? That can take a lot of different forms, but I think one of the forms that it takes is practicing some form of proportional giving. That is, you decide that all of your financial decisions are going to be rooted in your first decision of what proportion of what God has entrusted to me am I going to set aside for God's work in the world. Now, I don't debate with people whether that means doing that from net or gross. The answer is yes. One or the other. Choose net or gross. And I don't debate with either whether it all has to go to the church. Because there are many organizations in this world that are doing God's work and doing wonderful work. But that's the key, that we set aside a certain portion of our income to do God's work in the world. And if you do that, and if you make that a spiritual practice of being conscious of what proportion you are giving, and being conscious of how the organizations or where you're giving your money is doing God's work in the world, God will lead you into greater and greater generosity. That's when you know it's a gift of the Spirit, and move beyond a spiritual discipline and practice into really living in the spirit of generosity. It's when it becomes second nature and it becomes a great sense of joy. Questions, comments? Wow, what people argued with me yesterday? Well, not argued with me, but it's okay. So here's the next word, and that is the word pledge. So again, we've gone through steward, grace, generosity, and pledge. Now, we talk about making a pledge to the church and using pledge cards in a pretty, in a very secular way. And it's always tied to the budget. So I was stunned when I was preparing one of these presentations, and I went to Bible Gateway and I put in the word pledge, convinced that I would find nothing, and boy was I surprised. Pledge is like steward. It appears all through Scripture. So I asked myself, let me explore this, and what does it mean? And I've got two versions of this up here. In Him, Jesus, you also, when you had heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, and had believed in Him, were marked with the seal of the promised Holy Spirit. This is the pledge of our inheritance towards redemption as God's own people, to the praise of His glory. Now, pledge here has nothing to do with a pledge card, nor does it have anything to do with a budget. Throughout Scripture, the word pledge is used in the sense of a down payment, a first installment. If any of you have ever bought a house, you had to put down earnest money to ensure performance. So there is a sense here that a pledge is a symbol, a promise of what is yet to come. Let me give you another translation of this. You were marked in Him with a seal, the promised Holy Spirit, who is a deposit, guaranteeing our inheritance unto the redemption of those who are God's possession, to the praise of His glory. So when you ask people to make a pledge, what you're saying is, this is a symbol of what is yet to follow. You're making that first downstroke. And it needs to be a symbol of what is yet to come. So when people make a financial pledge, in our culture, money is what best symbolizes the fruit of our labors and the employment of all that God has given to us, our skills, our talents, our jobs. And so a gift of money best represents a sense of the whole, of who we are as a whole, complete people. And that pledge of money says, you know what, I'm in this 100% with all that I have and all that I am. And that's why we ask people to make a pledge. It's completely divorced from the budget.
Excuse me, is that Ephesians 1, my eye test has failed?
Yes, Ephesians 1, 13 through 14.
Thank you.
And that's radically different from any way probably that you've thought about pledge. So do you need a minute to take this in? You ready for me to go on? What? Yes.
The pledge that we make, I think our stewardship committee has been going down the track of it's the pledge that we make to our community because we belong to the community. And that's really a whole different road than you're going down, right? I mean, you're talking about a pledge as a steward. I'd just like you to comment on that.
Well, I like that. And there are, in fact, one of our narrative reflections this year in Tens on God the Giver was written by a Haitian woman who talks about, she grew up not with the word stewardship, but, I can't remember off the top of my head what the phrase was, but it was, if you belong to this community, then part of what we do is bring a part of ourselves to the community. And it is through our relationship to the community that we also have a relationship to God. And for me to have a relationship to God, I need to bring something to this community. So there is this sense that you're giving something that represents you as an individual for a greater good. So I don't think it's inconsistent. I think you just need to go more deeply into it. And this is what I'm trying to do is give you the sense of how the word is used scripturally, so that we can better ground our discussion and our understanding what Scripture tells us. So I would just invite you to have people think more deeply on that this is what we've been saying, and how is this consistent? How is this consistent with what Scripture has to tell us is the meaning of the word pledge? Other questions? Comments? Okay, moving right along. So when I was going to Bible Gateway, I also pushed in the word budget. And guess what I got? Sorry, no results returned. How many of you talk a lot about the budget during your stewardship campaigns? None of you? Really?
We tried to take that aspect out of it.
Yeah, it's hard because for so many years, those of us who have grown up in the church, we've always heard stewardship tied to the budget. And it is really hard to get that language out of there. And for people to divorce the idea of inviting people into a deeper relationship with God and into a deeper commitment. And I love this definition of budget that, we can only do what the budget allows. Well, not so much. Not so much, because God's grace comes to us in other ways other than through the budget. So really work hard. And you'll catch yourself. I catch myself sometimes talking about what the church needs and talking about church budgets because it's so ingrained in us to talk that way. But that is not scriptural. So I've tried to give you 4 other words to explore other than budget as you begin to talk to people about why we have stewardship campaigns.
Could I throw something in?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree that we need to get away from the budget talk, and yet we need to talk about stewardship, I think, as more than a spiritual practice, but also, I mean, not only something we do for our own spiritual health and those around us, but our stewardship, our giving, needs to be connected to the mission of the church, as we've heard so frequently this weekend. And that mission is powered in some sense by the budget.
We have a tendency to divorce money and mission. We get really enthusiastic about talking about our mission, and then it's like, oh, how are we going to raise the money to do it? And we divorce it if somehow they're not related, and they are. And to invite people into supporting the mission of the church by making a financial commitment, because you really believe that this is what God is calling you to do, that's when you say, I got skin in this game. I really believe in this. I believe that this is what God is calling us to do, and I'm in. And here's the symbol of how much that I'm in. So I think one of the biggest things that we do is try and separate out biggest mistakes we make is separating out money from mission. Because money follows mission. I'm not sure where I have it in these slides. We'll go on, but yeah, the choices we make with our money can change the world. That's one of the things that we need to talk about with people more. That the choices you make about how much money you spend on your car, or your country club, or the gym, or your hobbies, or whatever it is, to make a different decision with that money can change the world. And that gets to the very subject of mission. We have a choice. With every dollar we spend, am I going to spend this to honor God, or am I going to spend this to make my life a little, well, we delude ourselves into think it's going to be fuller or more fun. So this is what I'd like for you to do. Could you flip the lights on again for me, please? Thank you. I want you to write a tweet. Everybody know what a tweet is now? I want you to write a tweet and answer the question, why do I make a pledge to the church? 130 characters. 130 characters. 130 characters. And yeah, I know, you told me you had to go to the airport. Don't get bogged down on whether you have 130 characters or 150. The idea is make it short and sweet. Something you can say to people, and I want you to try and think about how to incorporate some of these biblical terms and meanings that we've talked about this morning. You know, as a steward, what difference does that make? As you experience God's grace, what difference does that make? As you want to practice generosity, what difference does that make? You want to make a pledge, what difference does that make? A pledge in the biblical sense, how does that inform what you do and what you say to other people about why you pledge? So I'm going to give you a few minutes and let you write your tweet. So one of the reasons I ask you to do this exercise is that when we're trying to learn a new way of thinking and talking, it's important to practice finding our own voice and finding our own words and not just using somebody else's. Because this way of thinking and talking about stewardship is really, really new for most people. And it's just important to take every opportunity to practice how you're going to do it. And in this day and age of sound bites, it's important to figure out how to do it as succinctly as possible. But when I thought about this is what I came up with. My money is a gift from God. God is at the center of all my financial decisions. I want to advance God's work in the world. So that's what I came up with. And I've thought about this since then, that gift is really not a good word. Gift makes you feel as if somebody has given you something and so it's now mine and I can do with it as I want. And that's really non-consistent with the whole notion of stewardship. So if I was doing that now, it'd be more giving to God some of what God gave to me. Something like that. So what have you all come up with as tweets?
I said
God calls me to share with the world part of the resources she has generously given to me.
Good.
Similar to what you said, I pledged to my church to affirm my intention to give gratefully to God a portion of what God's given me.
Good. Anybody else have a tweet? Yeah.
I said, I give back to the Lord because He's given everything to me.
Good. Good. That will. Anybody else have one that you want to share?
Celebrate life as a steward of God's gift to us.
So this is a one possible way to kick off a stewardship campaign. After you do a little bit of education, to ask everybody in the parish to do a tweet, and maybe you publish them on your website. Maybe you do a bulletin insert. Maybe you put little tweet birds, all the way down the hallway of your parish hall with a tweet on each one of them. But the idea is to get people to give voice to their idea of what it means to be a steward and to make a pledge, but to do it in theological terms. Or this may be a good way to wind up your stewardship campaign. You might take the little tweet bird and have them as placemats at a festive meal of some kind, a brunch or a dinner, and have people to take time to write their tweet on that and then later post them. Be creative about these things, but the idea is to get people to engage the ideas and give expression to it in their own voice. So I want to make sure that everybody's on board with the approach here in terms of the theology of stewardship, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about what it means in terms of how we organize ourselves. So anything about the theology of stewardship we've talked about? Okay. Now, how many of you are from congregations of, say, 25 or fewer? 50 or fewer? 100 or fewer? Wow, big churches. Okay. The reason I ask that is that in many of the churches where I come from in Vermont, they're so small we don't have teams. I mean, there's a small group of people that does everything. So since you're not in that category of people, I'm going to talk about stewardship teams because you're probably the leader of your stewardship team, right? Or at least you're on it. So number one, I think it is important for the vestry to be the theological center of whatever it is that you're teaching and learning about stewardship. Which points to the fact that the rector has to really be on board with teaching this theology of stewardship year-round. The vestry are the spiritual leaders of the congregation, and that's a changing concept of vestry in our church. If you are going to ask people in your congregation to change the way they think about stewardship, about pledging, about generosity, about grace, the vestry needs to not only be on board about that, they need to be doing their own work around it. Because leadership should not ask of the congregation that which they are not willing to do. So they need to demonstrate it. So the rector on a regular basis needs to be taking some of these concepts about stewardship. You could take use the leaflets that TENS has prepared this year around God the Giver, or go back and get back issues of things and have the vestry study and reflect on those. And someone on the vestry will, and more than one person on the vestry will have some very powerful stories to share. And that can be part of your kickoff about how you begin to generate conversation in the congregation. So your first task is to go back to the rector and share some of these concepts and say, how can we get the vestry to engage these? Now, some of you will go back to vestries that never do Bible study and meditation. And to the rector who says we don't have time, that's why I said in the very beginning, we only have one purpose in this church, and that's the formation of disciples. And we can't form leaders in the church without engaging spiritual concepts, scriptural concepts in some form. It doesn't always have to be Bible study, but you have to grapple somewhere along the lines with these theological terms and why we're doing what we're doing. So the rector has to get on board, and there's probably one or more persons on the vestry who really like this idea of grappling with these things, and get them as an ally and get them working with you and the rector on how to get the vestry on board with this, because the vestry needs to lead. One of the changes that we're seeing in the church is moving the vestry away from being the workhorses to truly being the spiritual leaders, and to doing that long-range thinking about where we are in the church. And that's a difficult struggle for rectors and vestries alike. One other thing I want to say about the vestry. That's one of the few places where a rector can come into contact with a person once a month over the course of 3 years, and for those who up for a second term, 6 years. It is an important opportunity for spiritual formation that a rector just simply cannot ignore. So that's another little point you can use when you go back and talk to your rector. So the vestry can't be the workhorse around the stewardship campaign. So you do need a team, and a team connotes at least 2 people. And a lot of times you'll get a phone call, and maybe this has happened to some of you, will you be our stewardship chair for this year? And then somehow you're expected to figure out how to do this. You have to have a team, and the rector and the vestry need to be in tune with who is out there thinking theologically that would be good to help us figure out a pattern of engaging the congregation in this thinking. So you got to have a team. And I think it's the vestry's responsibility to figure out the theme that they want to use for the year. Where is the congregation on? They can use the TENS material. In fact, if your congregation is at that point where they still do stewardship the old way, the rector writes a letter, the stewardship chair writes a letter, you have 3 lay witness talks, and you send out the pledge card. If that's your stewardship campaign, then I suggest that you take the God the Giver materials, go back and say, let's use these materials this year. And our task is to figure out how to get both the vestry and the congregation to engage these materials and talk about them. Because if you go back and say, we're not going to use these pledge cards anymore, or we're going to use all this new language, they won't have a clue what you're talking about. So make it easy on yourself.
Are those with TENS?
Yes.
Given materials?
Yes. And if your diocese is a member, they're free. If your diocese is not a member, then it's worth your while to get your congregation to join. But this is it's difficult to leave this conference and to go back and to try and share everything you've learned if people have never been. So truly make it easy on yourself. Use those materials because they're sound theologically. Okay? So in addition to your basic stewardship team that needs to discern how to disseminate this information, engage the congregation, to my way of thinking, these are the creative thinking people. What are the new and different ways and the communication tools we have to get people involved in thinking? Just like I ask you to write the tweet. What are other things we can do? I want you to be thinking about what you've done in your congregation, because sometimes the richness of this workshop is for people sharing what they have tried. A couple years ago, we did the theme of flourish in faith, and at the conference, somebody told us they sort of made a garden in their parish hall, using flowers to illustrate the lushness in a garden flourishing, and then they put all sorts of stewardship quotes and stories, brief stories, tweets, all through that garden, so that people during coffee hour or whenever they wanted to could walk through the garden and learn something about that, and people were free to add things to it. And last year for Walking the Way, there were some people who created stones in paper, but they looked like stones, and since it was Walking the Way, they created these walking paths, almost like a labyrinth, but on either one of them was some message or a story about stewardship. So that's the kind of creative thinking that can go on. Some of the other things that people have talked about, people have used videos very effectively. You can get people to tell their stories of God's grace or of generosity. videotape it and take little snippets out of it or use it in whole. That's a very effective, particularly with younger generations, that's a very effective way to communicate your story. Some people actually videotape people while they're giving their stories during sermon time or as an epistle or around the offertory. One of the really fun ones that came out yesterday that I've never seen it done personally, but you can find it on YouTube. It's called a cardboard testimony. Where have you seen it?
Yeah, we did.
All right, talk about that.
Well, it was just great. We had seen a video of a cardboard testimony from Emmanuel Episcopal Church in Houston that you can find online. And the idea is that you gather a group of, say, depends on the size of your congregation perhaps. We had about 8 people gathered together on Saturday morning, personally invited. People, I knew something of their story and how God's grace had changed their lives. And so on one side, we had big foam boards. And on one side was their then side, and on the other side is their now side. So my simple thing would be broken and then healed, perhaps. So we engaged them in the procession. This was the first day that we were kicking off the annual giving response. And so they process in the procession. They walk up to the altar, they turn around, they hold up the then side, people read it, then they turn it over, and they walk to the side, and we display those boards. And it was very powerful. I learned one thing that we didn't do right. People were completely unprepared for it. The congregation was. I think if we had just put a blip in the bulletin at the beginning, people would have realized what was going on before it was over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes it's good to shake people up,
Yeah.
especially in my congregation.
Well, I'm all for shaking people up. I wanted to have the maximum impact.
Right.
Don't want it to go unnoticed.
So it's more open.
Yeah.
What would you think your blip would be? What would you have said?
I actually did it myself. And
I meant in your bulletin, what would you say?
in the bulletin. By the way, that's probably an important thing for the rector to be involved
Right.
as well. This morning, we're opening our worship by a procession of cardboard testimonies in which members of the congregation will let you know how God has changed their lives. Something like that.
Did you videotape it?
We did.
Actually, I was looking to see
Not
if it's still on our
videotaping or
website.
whatever it is.
It might still be on our website, I'm not
Sure,
sure.
you could look at ours.
I
Yeah.
did watch one
It's
of those
not on there.
yesterday.
We've got it, I know it's on our YouTube
little
channel, but
music
we could
background.
find it later.
It's
if
like
we
simple
wanted.
and powerful.
Yeah. What are the-
It was very powerful, just, I mean, even though it was really just a few words, I thought it was really powerful, and it was a way that people who might not otherwise be comfortable with talking about their story, just to be able to show it. I
It's
thought
even
that was
shorter
good
than a
too.
tweet, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
But there are those people that will not get up and tell a story, but they'll do something like that. Yeah.
I've heard of examples too where actually the parish that originally did this site, I was speaking with a woman who was involved in it, and she said there were a couple of anonymous people who their stories were pretty tough. So they didn't really want to be up there, so they had somebody else in the church hold up the statements for them. So pretty much anybody can say what they want.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about the preparation of people that are invited to do the cards. What is the process for that? It seems like that part of the formation would be really important and take time to discern those words and self-revelation and that.
It is important. And I mean, I think obviously it was probably had more impact on those who carried the posters than those who witnessed the posters. it was when we gathered to do the posters, it was a great opportunity for sharing stories. I put together a little kind of agenda for that meeting.
And who did you invite?
People in the congregation whom I knew God was working on. And some of the people on the stewardship team made suggestions too for people to be invited, because I don't know everything that's going on with everybody. If you like, I put together a little agenda for that meeting, and I'd be happy to email it out or email it to you.
Yeah, if you, because the PowerPoint and my audio recording is going to go on our diocesan website as quickly as we can get it up. We'll do a little bit of editing on the audio, and would love, may even add the somebody's YouTube video of that practice, and then if we had that example to go with it, would be really a helpful tool. Yeah.
Which diocese?
Vermont, Diocese of Vermont, yes.
The person in Houston who started this also said that I'm just trying to, I'm not questioning what we've already got out there, I'm just adding, because I had this
Absolutely.
really long conversation with her. She said she also strategically asked a few of the people who she didn't know at all, because they were wanting to get, just see what happened. Maybe they would,
Right.
maybe they wouldn't. And so it was a way to get to know more about parishioners that they really didn't know that much about, and a few of them had amazing stories. So,
Yeah, I think it's a good practice to try and combine those things. To those people that you know are growing and maturing spiritually and have that kind of rich relationship, to make sure they're present. But there's nothing wrong with inviting anybody who wants to do this to show up. Those people who are going to, that's self-selecting. So if they come, they're interested in sharing their stories. They're interested in this process. And we have long known in stewardship circles that the more people that you can gather in small group to share stories, reflect, and give voice to their experiences of God, that's where stewardship growth comes from. It's not from, it really is all about that sharing notion and enriching our life and faith and an experience of God's grace and community. That's where growth comes from. So regardless of whether you're asking people to come and you're setting up the video camera and come tell your story on video, or whether you're doing this, it really doesn't matter what you're doing, as long as you're helping people to engage and share stories. That's where growth comes from.
I think the next time we do it, I will make an open invitation.
Yeah, because people who are going to say no, we're not going to come. I mean, what do you lose by doing that? So have other people tried other means of communication that you want to share? Yeah.
We've done stewardship statements, meaning just a sentence or two from the stewardship committee, and a casual picture of them with their family, and then we put them we'll use them in our Sunday bulletins. We do posters, put them in the hallways, and we also did some video and put that on our website, and people love it.
Yeah.
The ones that have their children involved, the children love it. So I think it's, our church is really big, and I think it's good for others to see that, wow, they come out and said that, and their whole family. And so now I'm thinking, we have some of those posters, and we're collecting more, that how powerful would it be to invite them to a presbytery meeting, and they all come in holding their own poster. And, we do a commissioning also of the stewardship committee. But I think that I really want to get our vestry fired up. So that would be really powerful if they came in holding the picture of their family and their statement. And just said, join me. Kind of get the conversation.
Yeah. So this is the fun part of stewardship, and it's the reason I encourage people to, and this is a conversion for me. I'm really big on congregations developing their own program, their own theme, their own theological reflections. But if you're in the midst of changing your culture in your church, then take the burden of developing those materials off of you and do your creative thinking about how you elicit the stories. And then, so that's the fun part of stewardship. You know, the rest of it can be really hard work and time consuming, but if you've got the theological teaching material, then you can just have fun with how you capture those stories and tell them. So I really commend that to you if you're really trying to change the culture around stewardship in your congregation.
Sounds a lot better than calling people on the phone to ask how much they're going to give.
Yeah. It's a whole lot more fun, yes.
In our little church, we have less than 100 people on Sundays. One thing that we're doing, that we've started doing, and we've got the idea from, I'm new to the stewardship thing, but off of the TIN's website, I guess, our rector said, you know, watch this webinar, and we did, and we took some ideas, and one was something about, we kind of mixed it up. I think it was called Ministry Moments.
Right.
But, you know, where you, different people speak and just highlight a ministry. And we've done this where I got put on charge of that, where I contact different guild leaders, and I'm learning so many things. And so each month we highlight a guild or a ministry, outreach ministry, and we'll say, we'll have them stand up, but and so we're thanking the congregation that, you know, your giving makes it possible for this, but we're also thanking those members and recognizing their gifts that they, you know, Sunday after Sunday, you know, they're here to minister to us in whatever way, you know, choir, whatever. But it's also, it's beautiful because on the outreach side, we're seeing there's so many things that if you don't really know what's going on, you don't know. Such as, I've been there 9 years, and there's something called Ewing House that this small group has been going to and serving this community that it's like a housing little community that they live together, but they have their own little apartments, and different churches or groups will go and feed them once a week or whatever. And I had no idea. And they stood up and were talking about what a blessing this was, and then they talked about going to the refrigerator and seeing there was no food in there. And I was like, oh, well, I have to bring food. Right. You know, so it gets people excited about giving generously, and it also highlights your church, and you think, oh, well, they do so many wonderful things. So you want to be part of that community.
Exactly.
And that's just one of the, you know, but it's a great thing to highlight.
It is.
What's going on, and let people know. Ministry moments are great. Yeah. That's
I want to go back to calling, because we've kind of resurrected calling. We called the last 2 years. We called during December and January. And it's really not hard because, you know, we're saying Merry Christmas, hope to see you Christmas Eve. You know, we hadn't gotten a pledge card, let me know. And it's very cheerful. It's not. I mean, some of them have said, we hope you'll consider raising your pledge, but it's not hardcore at all. But I'm thinking, maybe we start calling now. We want to thank you, because I thank people year-round. I write them notes year-round. I've even had people call me and say, thank you for writing me a note. Or call me, why are you writing me a note? Are you writing me a note because I pledged? I'm like, yes, I am. But we do have vestry right. We have our committee right. We do a lot of thinking, but I'm thinking we can call now. I just want to thank you, you know, with a different message. Use some of these different words and just call all the time, because our church is so big that we have a form we use, and a lot of people, we learn a lot of pastoral care needs.
Absolutely.
Especially during December, a lot of aging parishioners with health concerns, and it's really helpful because nobody else is calling consistently. And then we plug them into pastoral care, and they might get a meal, they'll get a visit, they, you know, then they get in the system, so to speak. So, you know, as far as it goes on the hardcore stewardship calling,
you know, I'm not so much on that, but I think it is important, especially if you're in a large church, to have a personal call from a church member.
Well, and when you say hardcore stewardship calling, most people equate that with, have you turned in your pledge card, or are you going to make a pledge this year? And that's not the point of a stewardship campaign.
Yeah.
The point of the stewardship campaign is to help people connect more deeply with their identity as stewards, with God's grace, with the generosity they experience in their life. I mean, what if you did a telephone call campaign that was really all about, you know, we're just trying to take a poll, like, what are you most grateful for in your life? Would you make a list of the 10 things that you're most grateful for and send it in to us? It would be astounding. You would get some stories that were worth printing. Because some people are going to make a list, some people are going to ignore you, some people are going to say health, family, and home, and job, and that's it. But some people are going to tell you a story of deep gratitude. So that brings me on down here to, I know this slide's a little hard to see, but I don't like talking to you in the dark, so. Other than vestry and stewardship team, part of what the stewardship team and the vestry have to decide are what are the biblical principles that we want to teach this year. Now, if you're using the TENS material, the theme is God the giver. And so we're getting at this notion of steward, that God is the giver of all that we have and all that we are. And that's the theme. So you've got that. Then the role of the stewardship team is to be as creative as you can possibly be about how to elicit those stories of people's experience of God's generosity and God's grace in their life. And the telephone campaign would be a great way to do that. Or, you know, do a special email blast inviting that for people. Just, you know, hit reply and give it. And some people are going to do it. So you decide on what it is that you're going to teach. But one of the downsides, I think, of our liturgy as we do it is that we really don't give people an opportunity to respond individually with their stories and what's in their heart. So that's the real fun part of stewardship, of how do you invite people into a process of engagement and reflection and sharing? How do you elicit those stories from people? And the idea of just having another meeting or inviting people to come back to church or even stay after church just doesn't work anymore. Some people will come, and it's worth doing for those people who will come. But if there are other groups that are already meeting, like if the choir meets from rehearsal, ask for a few minutes before a choir meeting to say, why do you sing in the choir? How do you experience God's grace or God's generosity through singing in the choir? You're going to get some powerful stories. If the Sunday school teachers gather even once a year, be prepared to ask that question of them. If the altar guild teams meet, talk with them. I mean, just get people talking wherever they are. To engage whatever materials you're using and to really reflect on whatever your theme is. That's where growth comes from. In yesterday's session, I limited the idea of a liturgical celebration to if you use pledge cards. And if you all are still doing stewardship the old way, you're not going to be able to get rid of pledge cards this year. The vestry will have a stroke if you try and convince them to get rid of pledge cards. And so will your church treasurer. So don't fight that battle. But instead, focus on how to celebrate these theological concepts, particularly that concept of a pledge, liturgically. And make it make it as a high festival celebration as your church can make it. So that there is a lot of teaching that goes on at that time. There's some the best of your powerful personal stories get shared in some way at that thing. Make sure that the kids have an opportunity to express their experience of God the giver. Because if the kids are involved and they're on parade that day, mom and daddy are going to come, and aunts and uncles are going to come, and grandparents are going to come. You're going to touch a lot of people that you wouldn't otherwise touch. And kids add joy. And they get these deep theological principles in a way that adults just can't seem to get to, and they touch the hearts of adults. So make sure the kids have an opportunity to participate in this. special music, and make the whole thing upbeat and festive so that people leave saying, wow, I haven't felt so good and I don't know when. If you're going to have pledge cards, then invite everybody to come up to the altar and put their pledge card on the altar. And let them know well in advance that this is the plan for this year. But make it, truly a celebration. The TENS will be providing a prayer over pledge cards and a pledge card itself. And the pledge card itself is a teaching tool. So if you're going to use a pledge card, whatever it says on there, make sure that there's some teaching about that from the pulpit or on the website. The most traditional phrase that goes on a pledge card is, in thanksgiving for all that God has given to me, I want to return a portion of what God has given me to God. Well, most people will sign that pledge card with the same amount that they gave last year without thinking about it. Give them an opportunity to think about it in some way. Give them an opportunity to think about it. And honor that intention and there's something very powerful about it. It's why we stand up and we go forward to receive the Eucharist rather than it being passed to us. There's something about standing up and moving forward to claim this, to receive, to move closer towards God. And there's something very powerful to do that with those pledge cards as well. So a big liturgical celebration. And I think it's good if it's the culture of your church to then end with some sort of festive meal or brunch or just more expanded coffee hour so that people have an opportunity to stand around and say, wasn't that wonderful? Did you hear what he or she said? Or golly. If the kids write letters, make sure that the letters are out for people to go around and read them. People will stay and they will share because of the excitement that you've created in the air. So give people a chance, even those people who have refused your invitation to a meeting, refused your invitation to share what they're grateful for. They're just not there, but they will get caught up in the Spirit. They will get caught up in the Spirit. And while they may not change much in terms of their sense of generosity this year, if they keep coming back, then over time, the Spirit will work on them. They'll get caught up in it. I don't have it on here, but the last thing I really want to talk about is that whole notion of thank you. Is that a good thank you campaign in a congregation is worth its weight in gold. Very few people have ever received a personal thank you from anybody in leadership to say thank you for supporting the church financially. And they will be deeply touched. They will say, really? You're not calling to ask me to do something? You're not, really? You just called to say thank you? Yeah. Because not everybody who comes here chooses to support the church financially, and we're really grateful that you do. And so I'm just calling on behalf of the vestry and all of the members of this church to say thank you for your commitment. That touches people. And so to have a well-organized thank you campaign to all of those people, it should include a very, if you can, personalized handwritten note from the rector. If it is in your culture, or you can move towards acknowledging the amount of the gift, or that your gift, thank you for giving again, acknowledging the history of giving, or thank you for increasing the amount that you have pledged. I mean, something to let people know that somebody's watching and somebody's really appreciating what you're doing, and it should be as personal as possible. And in addition to that, if your vestry and stewardship committee can, over a course of time, make those phone calls and say to people, we really do thank you, it really helps people. It helps them own that this is important, that this is important to the life of the congregation, and that they help these other ministries happen. If you plan these two things well in advance, and they are really festive and celebratory, and you really, over a time, it may take a couple of years, you'll find that 90% of your pledge cards will come in on that Sunday or within a week following. And the kind of follow-up, you won't be 7 months getting all your pledge cards in. you'll find over time that people really enjoy participating in that liturgical act. And then it'll be very few phone calls to get, or emails. Somebody brought up yesterday that emails sometimes in this day and age are more effective to remind people, thank you for your giving in the past. We haven't heard from you this year. We look forward to hearing from you. That 99% of the time, people that don't turn in their pledge cards who have pledged before have just gotten busy, and it's in the stack of mail, and they just haven't gotten to it. So that's my pitch for how to do stewardship in the congregation. So what other questions, comments, suggestions, ideas? Yes, Steve?
You started the presentation talking about doing pledge cards. You don't need them. Now you end it, you're talking about pledge cards. So let's go back to the beginning.
All right.
So I can see some good reasons to try to get out of pledge cards because, like you said, they're not absolutely necessary. We look at the spreadsheets from the previous years to come up with the budget. But what about the pledge card being a symbol of someone's commitment? How do you continue that without a little 8x5 card or something like that?
Well, I first of all, I really do wish that we would get rid of pledge cards because I think it gets us off track. We begin putting so much time and energy into getting those pledge cards in and getting them out and focusing on that we really do get off track of the spiritual formation piece that we're about to. But I've been in Vermont preaching this sermon for 8 years, and it's a hard sell. And the treasurers just have heart attacks. I just cannot imagine. So I don't want to send you out here with a charge to go back to your congregation and start a campaign to get rid of your pledge cards.
You're not the only one preaching this, so I mean it's a good message.
So what I have started doing is okay, so what are people doing already that they're going to continue, and how can I help people make that more theological and make that more about formation? So I actually had this idea I worked on 1 year of let's do forever how many weeks you do this teaching and engagement and reflection. Maybe we send a pledge card out every week and it has a different question on it. And maybe the first week is as simple of how many years have you been giving to the church? And for some people it will be 0 and some people it will be all my life. And maybe the next week is what is the single biggest factor in how much you give to the church? What are in the next week, what factors in your life prevent you from giving even more of your money away? Maybe 1 week is where are all of the organizations that are doing God's work in the world do you give your money? But every week you're leading people into a deeper reflection about their relationship with their money and the basis on which they make those decisions. So that when you do finally come up with a pledge card that says, in thanksgiving for all that God has given to me, you've really helped them think through what that dollar amount is going to be. So I couldn't get anybody to do that one either, but I'm full of these great ideas that I think people should try. And if any of you try these things, do let me know. But the other way to do it is you could have ministry moments inviting those same kind of questions. And in cooperation with your rector, you could actually give people time to stand up and talk about that. So that each week there's somebody that offers a question and answers it for themselves and shares that with the congregation. So again, you're leading them deeper and deeper into conversation. And to get rid of the word budget and to shift the emphasis that we need to give. There are physiological studies out there now that show that giving is good for your health. It works the same way as exercise and creating those endorphins and those good chemical reactions in your body. Giving does that. We are created to be generous givers. And so to help people realize that is our task. And how they work it out is largely between them and God. So does that help?
So speaking personally, I find it theologically useful to do the act of making a pledge. And I find it practically useful to, having made the pledge, to know, to remember to give money and to make sure I do it on a schedule, that if I didn't have a pledge, I would be missing the endorphins that I get from making it, and the guidance it gives me for my behavior in actually implementing the gift in the course of the year.
I think that's really true, and I've had that same experience in my own life. Mm-hmm. That it's, for me, giving proportionally. If I give enough money away, then I am inevitably going to look at all of the toys that my friends have that I don't have and say, why can't I afford that toy? And then I'm going to remember that I gave that money away and say, okay, I've got a choice here. Am I going to spend my money on those toys, or am I going to give first to God? And I love being in that position, that I'm always called back to answer that question again and again and again. And so that's why I do it. But there are too many churches where the amount given is the same every year without any thought.
Yeah.
And so how do you balance those things out and give people that opportunity for that spiritual discipline? And I think if you do those series of questions, one of it is to invite people to figure out proportionally how much of their income do they give. And did I say this before? I never argue with them whether it's net or gross. Never argue with them when there's net. It's like, if you and God can get into a relationship where you're giving a proportion of your income away, God will take care of the rest. I'm not worried about that. So don't get drawn into that debate. Just say, yeah, it is. One or the other. Choose one. Go. Yes?
I'm rather new in my parish now. I'm the rector in Spokane Valley. And I was very surprised when I first came that right in the middle of their service, they have a blessing time, and it is elaborate. People are invited to come out it's ostensibly just for birthdays or anniversaries, but now people come up just to come up. And recently, a man who has had a horrible experience and nearly died, and it turns out he has brain cancer, and he's in and out, but he's come up recently, and he clearly has holes, and I mean, it's very graphic, and his body is swollen because of the medications, and so, but he came up and just did, and he's a little vacant now because of the surgeries, but he came up and just stood there, and his wife stands next to him because he can't easily, but he just stood there and thank God, and there just wasn't a dry eye in the house. But now it's expanded that people don't just talk about blessings in the typical sense, and I really appreciate what you said. It's not just the normal, but it's even naming and finding the energy of those really hard moments in our lives together. And that the community is a great place to do that. I was really worried when I first came because I saw the time period just like growing. It's just like our time of peace. It's like, but I think the bigger sense of all of it is blessing because we're together, and it has been a powerful, moving time for it.
If you got to cut time, cut somewhere else.
Yeah.
Don't cut that.
It's like, maybe we should cut the Eucharist.
No.
No, I know.
But that is a really particular example of the big thing that we're talking about, is how do we infuse with what we're already doing with a new kind of theology. And sometimes when I'm presiding in a parish, and I do a lot of supply work since I'm on diocesan staff, we'll come to the prayers of the people, and there's just absolute silence. And I won't interrupt at that point, but then before I start the Eucharist time, I say, is anybody grateful for anything today? I mean, really, do you anything? I mean, just anything? Just prompt people to say, there's two things we do before we worship. We prepare what it is that we want to offer to God, and we prepare our offering of thanksgiving. That's just part of what it means to worship. So your congregation is doing that in a very special and unique and organic way, and that's a blessing Because that tells me you've got a spirit there to work with, to really build and mature. Yeah, that's really a blessing.
And then you close that with the Thanksgiving prayer that we all
Yeah.
say together.
Yeah, that's really awesome.
The other thing is when I find that, and I can be sleepy too, but I find that their energy is like come in and I'll say, oh, I did not hear that at all.
Yeah.
And just go over, what does amen mean? It means,
Yeah.
I'm there,
Yeah.
I'm with you. And so then
Yeah.
if they're just kind of slow on, let's go love and serve the Lord. No, we're not.
Right, make them do it again. Make them do it again. I do that with the great amen at the end of the Eucharist. It's like, do what? I mean, folks, this is the high point of the service. Let's try this again. And they all laugh and smile, but then they shout it out. I mean, they really get in touch with that sense of joy that has brought them to church to begin with. The other thing I want to mention is, the prayer book has a number of offertory sentences, which to me make no sense. They're pretty poetry, but they really make no sense. In terms of what we're inviting people to do, because this is the time that they offer their money. Let's tell them at the offertory what it is we're doing. At this point, we invite you to put into the offering plate the symbol of commitment that you have made to God's work in the world. And let's do it with joy and with thanksgiving and with grateful hearts. Whatever works for you and your rector, but let's be very specific about what it is that we're inviting people to do and celebrate that moment. Some people, some churches, when the offering comes forward, it's just like reading the gospel. I mean, the acolytes are out there and the crucifer is up there, and it's a big deal because it is a sacred, holy moment. Many priests don't like to leave the plate of money on the altar. I think it's important, because it is the offering of the people. It is a giving up of some portion of that which God has given to us, and I think it's holy and sacred and deserves to be there. Now, you may get into a real fight with your rector about that, but at least have the conversation. Other thoughts?
We just recently, we're still using the offertory sentence, but we just recently started to put a rubric in the bulletin saying what we're doing here at the offertory and why we are offering to God joyfully some of what God's given us.
So if people are accustomed to seeing that, that's a nice little place to put one of those little snippets that somebody might share. Just like a cardboard ministry. This is what I'm doing.
A tweet.
A little tweet. This is what I am doing during this period of time. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Well, bless you all in your ministry as you go back and do this. This is not always easy work, because you really are working against something that's really been ingrained in people for a very long time. And it's really very much in contrast to the culture about the way that we think about our lives and that which we own. Jesus talked about money as a barrier to the life and faith. And if we don't talk about it in the church, people aren't going to have an opportunity to talk about it. And the world right now is just full of anxiety and talk about money. And people want their faith to make a difference. So let's help them understand that. Well, thank you all. And if I am going to be getting this PowerPoint and some version of the audio up on the website, but if you'd like for me to send it to you via email before that, I'll be happy to do that if you'll just write down your email address. And I am always happy to take telephone calls and coach people or support people or encourage them when things get tough, so don't hesitate to contact me. Would love to hear from you. Okay.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.